So welcome everybody to this month's or this week's SALT Talks. Tonight we are my name is Patty Schramm. I'm the Parent Resource Coordinator and Trainer for the SALT Talk sessions. We're going to be hearing a presentation tonight, as it's up on the screen: relationships, sexuality, social media, and safety. Big topic for this transition age. And we're going to be hearing from our speaker, Amanda. I'll let her tell a little bit about herself. And I'm just going to turn it over to her because I know you have a lot to cover tonight, Amanda.
I sure do. So I was giving the first disclaimer is that it's a lot of content to cover in a short period of time. And this is really just to try to share as many resources and ideas and concepts with you as many as possible. And then for you to be able to take a deeper dive into that information. So my name is Amanda Tipkemper. I am the Vice President of Education at the Children's Home, which is a nonprofit located in Cincinnati, Ohio. I used to also work at the Cincinnati Center for Autism, and I worked there. And we worked with kids from pre-diagnosis all the way through adulthood. At the Children's Home, I've really focused in on working with transition-aged youth. So since I've been at the Children's Home, I was running a high school for students on the autism spectrum. That is now expanded to a program for middle school, high school, and a transition program. I've worked in the developmental disability community for my entire career, and several years ago, I think 9, maybe 10 years ago, TJ Nastide and I were asked to start presenting on this topic, and kind of delved right into it. And his experience is in the from Children's Hospital and at the Hamilton County Developmental Disabilities Services. So his was more of the research side and the more clinical side, whereas mine has been the actual teaching the sex ed classes. So we've had sex ed classes at the Heights Center, which is our developmental disability specific school at the Children's Home. And we've expanded that actually into a comprehensive wellness program now. So we get to actually walk the walk and talk the talk, and we have a lot of different experiences based on that. So I hope that I'm able to meet everybody where they're expecting me to meet them, and that I can serve as a resource in the future if you have any really specific questions that this presentation doesn't address. So I've worked with kids from pre-diagnosis through adulthood and advanced adulthood. I used to run the support group for adults in the autism spectrum, adults, the adults with autism support group through the Autism Society of Greater Cincinnati. And I ran that group for 5 years. And sorry, I'm trying to get there we go. And I have worked with individuals that range from, hyperlexic and reading at the age of 3 to not toilet trained at the age of 17 with significant behavior, to individuals who have multiple college degrees and speak languages. And so the oldest individual I've actually worked with at this point is 70 years old. And what I've learned over the years is that while we can have these broad constructs and these broad resources, when it really comes down to working with individuals, it has to be individualized. And I know I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't know. So the objectives of this presentation, we're going to be talking about puberty. It's going to be pretty quick, and I can go in deeper. When we first started presenting on this topic, it was just around puberty and relationships. That expanded into puberty, relationships, and sexuality, just based on the feedback we were getting from our audience. And then over the years, as we become more immersed in the world of technology, we included social media and overall safety. And I could talk a lot about the different experiences we presented to families, to professionals. We've provided this content to individuals with developmental disabilities in different venues and different lengths of time. So lots of different experiences there. And I really want to try to leave time for Q&A, but as Patty shared, if you have questions that are relevant to the slides while we go through, please do ask those. So this is a disclaimer just as a result of multiple years of providing this training. We've been asked to speak more about different intersections with sexuality, with gender, with race, and it's very difficult to get that individualized in this presentation. And you'll notice as we go through, there's a lot of content. So what we've done is we've tried to gather some resources at the end, and that's for self-advocates, that's for people of color, that's for people that want to learn more about the LGBTQ. So there are more resources, but we're not going to get in really, really deep into those subjects on this presentation. So the importance of a comprehensive sex education. So one of the lovely things about working at a private school, at a charter non-public, is that you have some freedom in how you design your curriculum and how you schedule your day. And when I first came to the children's home, just based on experiences over the years, one of the first things that we did was integrate a sex education curriculum and a comprehensive sex education curriculum, because what we realized is that students weren't getting this. And they weren't getting it either because they didn't have, the ability to be mainstreamed into a classroom and they needed a very specialized curriculum, or they were being mainstreamed into that classroom, but not with the right support. So they weren't accessing the information in a way that made sense to them, or in a way that they really needed. So we, over the years, have really advocated for our families and providers to intentionally ask for students to have access to this, because it is so important that our kids have it. This NPR investigation, if we had a longer period of time, I would play it. It's a 7-minute radio spot, but if you click that link, if you have access to the PowerPoint, it's a really, really comprehensive investigation, multi-part, and it just talks about the importance of this and how many adults that are out there that did not have access to sex education because people did not see them maybe as needing it. But when it comes down to it, what we have found over the years is that actually adults with developmental disabilities can be up to 7 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than a typical person. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of knowledge and a lack of awareness around safety and boundaries and things like that. So it's so important for us to advocate for our kids to have access to this. So this just talks about, there's a lot of fears, and I understand that parents have fears that, if their kids have access to this information, they might, use it in the wrong way. And I can tell you anecdotally as an administrator, so I've been a principal, I have a principal's license, and I've been overseeing education programs since I've been at the children's home 2012. And we've run a lot of these classes, and I'm going to share some resources of how we shape those discussions and make sure they're occurring in the right place. But we don't have kids using the information inappropriately. We don't have kids using the terminology inappropriately. And if they are, they're not doing it, when we are observing it, and families are not reporting it either. So really when it comes down to it, and there's a link at the bottom down here, at the very bottom of the slideshow, when it comes down to it, sex education, a comprehensive sex education is actually proven to delay intercourse, reduce the frequency of intercourse, reduce the number of sexual partners, and increase condom and contraceptive use. So there is safety and knowledge. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the ever popular puberty. I'm at home doing this presentation, so I usually will reference the fact that I am the mother. My daughter just walked into the room and she's shaking her head. I am the mother of a 20-year-old daughter, and my daughter is typically developing for all intents and purposes. But, I started in this field when she was about 2 years old, and I've gotten to observe her experiences over the years and compare those to the experiences of the families that I support and the kids that I support. And I hope that provides me with some credibility and also the ability to contrast what I've observed. So puberty happens to all kids. And years ago, we were doing a presentation, and this was when we were in person, and a dad raised his hand and asked, how do we skip this part? And there's no skipping it. Puberty is just a natural part of development, and every single kid's going to go through it. If they're verbal, if they're nonverbal, if they're seemingly, childlike and or not. I mean, kids are going to go through puberty. And I think one of the most important things that we can do to support the kids that we serve, or the kids that, we're raising, is to have conversations with them. It is uncomfortable. Not everybody wants to have it on either side of the table. But what I like to say is this. So I've worked with some pretty impacted kids that have no language, that have behavior issues, that are not toilet trained, like I said. And I just want you to imagine going through, turning 11, and you're a girl and you start your period and nobody's talked to you about it, and how terrifying that must be. The same thing if you're a boy and suddenly hair starts sprouting out of your arms and it wasn't there before. And we have individuals that, might be a little rigid in their acceptance of change and transition. So the earlier that we can have these conversations, the better, the more that we can normalize the experience of puberty and just the experience of change. And in some instances, for individuals who might be really rigid against change, it's important for us to let them know that changes occur throughout their life, because as people get older, your body changes when you have kids. Your body changes when you turn 30. Women go through menopause. Men have erectile dysfunction. There's things that happen that we need to prepare whether it be our child or whether it be someone we serve, so they don't come as a surprise, so they're not terrifying and they don't feel completely alone when they are going through those. So the more that we can pre-plan and pre-teach, the better our kids can be prepared for those changes. So I'm not going to go into puberty in great depth. There's so many resources out there, but I want to highlight some areas. Here's a funny meme. Welcome to being a parent of a teenager. Prepare for a large amount of eye-rolling, emotional outbursts, and thoughts of running away. And that's just the parents. And I think we can all relate to that, especially if you've had a teenager. But we can expect those physical changes, right? So you have rapid growth, and with rapid growth can come pain. And if you have an individual you're supporting or that you love that doesn't have a lot of language, it's hard to express that pain. And even for typical kids, I remember going through a growth spurt and really not understanding what I was experiencing. But it can be very painful. It can be painful in your legs and your hips. And that can sometimes translate into emotional outbursts. The onset of menarche, so the development of breasts for girls, testicular growth for boys, development of body hair. So again, things that can be really scary to someone if we don't actually sit down and explain. And there's so many resources. I did send a resource list to Patty that I hope is also on that page. And it's full of books, full of websites. And I really hope it helps you individualize what you're looking for. So hormonal changes, these are things that impact mood and behavior, they impact sleep, and they impact metabolism in every kid, right? So if you have a kid who has a developmental disability, sometimes they can happen earlier. And sometimes they happen later, but they are more than likely going to happen. And it's really important to know that all of these things happen in stages and it can be ongoing. For girls, puberty can start as early as 10 now. A lot of times for boys, it's closer to 11 and 12 years old, but every single kid is going to be different. So again, just making sure that we're having those conversations before those things happen as much as possible. And if you have a kid who's 14 or 15 and you haven't had those conversations, it's not too late. And it is uncomfortable. When I was young, my parents just gave me books. I was a big book reader. So I just they didn't really want to have the conversation with me. I think my dad, of all people, tried to sit down and have a talk with me when I was 16 years old. And I was like, really, Dad? A little too late. I've already read all the books and been in health class, and I know a lot more than you think I know. And that's the other piece, is that our kids are going to be exposed to this. Whether or not we're the ones who sit down and talk to them about it, they are going to be exposed, whether that just be by going to school, whether that be through TV shows or YouTube, they're going to be exposed. So it's our opportunity to shape how they process that information. So another thing to talk about really quickly is just with hygiene. This becomes a really prominent issue with individuals when they get into puberty, and especially individuals with developmental disabilities, individuals who might be reliant on others for those hygiene tasks. The earlier we can start, the better. We always cite a local family who has triplets with autism that have, they're pretty significantly impacted. And the mom told us a story about the fact that she started practicing her kids putting on deodorant by themselves when they were 8 years old, because she knew it was going to take longer to get them to a place of independence. So starting early and practicing regularly, really important to make sure that we're, practicing regular bathing. And I understand, I work at a school full of 100 kids, 12 to 22 years old, that have autism or a related diagnosis. And I understand that it's not as easy as just saying, go get in the shower. But I think that we want to definitely set that expectation. We want to try to build it into the routine as early as possible as well. Same with brushing your teeth, using deodorant, shaving. And a lot of people have to adapt that for sensory reasons, whether that be your legs, your armpits, or your face. Menstrual care and the need for clean clothes. And this is something that can be really challenging. But when we think about wanting our kids to integrate and be accepted, into, a mainstream classroom or into school, this is a hard conversation. And I know that there are some families that this might hit a sore spot, but if you have a kid that has hygiene issues, it's going to be a lot harder for them to be accepted by their peers. If they do have body odor, it's going to be a lot harder for them to be accepted by their peers. So it's just something that we need to consider. If that's a motivation for the individual that you're supporting or that you're working with, that can be really, really helpful to use that as a motivation. You can work with an occupational therapist or a physical therapist on hygiene, and they can also support with toilet training. Toilet training is a big piece as well when it comes to independence, and just the experience of hygiene in puberty is so much more challenging. Toilet training makes it even more complicated when you're also going through puberty. So like I said, I've worked with kids who are actively going through puberty and they are not toilet trained. And that can be really complicated, and it can literally get pretty messy. So those are things just to keep in mind. If you haven't actually had the experience of puberty yet, it's something that I want you to bear in mind. And then we have individuals that might have cerebral palsy or spina bifida supporting students who use wheelchairs, and how we work through puberty and how we work through hygiene with individuals like that are going to be very individualized and very different as well. It's important to have a primary care physician who you can have these conversations with, and sometimes who we can rely on having those conversations with our kids as well, right? So that's a really good place to have those conversations in a school setting, bringing it up during IEP meetings, making sure you're talking to your intervention specialist about what resources are available in the school setting to get your kids educated about puberty, and just having those conversations. If you're not the one who's really comfortable having them, trying to find somebody who is important. Sometimes it's, that crazy cool aunt. Sometimes it's a sibling, an older sibling. Sometimes it's, a neighbor who has a great relationship. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be you. And sometimes it comes, sometimes it's received better when it's not a parent. And that's, again, another experience that I've had over the years. So were there any questions regarding puberty? I know that was a really, really quick gloss about that before we move on. And like I said, I have a lot of resources. I'm going to encourage everybody, if you have specific questions that you're not comfortable sharing in this forum, just please feel free to reach out to Patty, and she'll put you in connection with me and TJ. So relationships. Like I said, I've been running programs for quite some time, and I have gotten to observe a variety of different relationships in a high school setting, as you can imagine. So, and what we have realized, I think everybody's realizing over the years, and some of you who are parents are realizing, is that, adolescents with physical and developmental disabilities seem to participate on a regular basis in fewer social activities and intimate relationships than they're typically developing peers. And this can be a point of frustration. It can feel very isolating. It can, increase people's anxiety, their depression, if they're seeing and observing other people in relationships and they're not in a relationship and they don't feel like that's an option. That can actually exacerbate. And going back to puberty really quickly, one of the things that is really important to consider if your kid is going through puberty, or if they are going through puberty, what I've noticed, again, anecdotally, is that there is a group of kids that really struggle with puberty. And that might be because they're experiencing a lot more hormones, they're having a harder time with self-regulation, their medicines are not being adjusted for those growth spurts. Or if a kid is, if a girl is going through her period, she's going to have bursts of hormones and she is going to experience PMS. So those are things that we want to keep in mind, and make sure that you're having those conversations with your doctor, with your related service providers, so they can support you, so you're not alone while you go through that. But it is something that I've seen on a regular basis, is that some of the behaviors that have been gone for 10 years that parents haven't seen since their kid was 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, sometimes rear their ugly head when a kid goes through puberty, because they're going through such an intense amount of change that it's really hard for them to self-regulate again. So it's just something to bear in mind. So again, we know this social maturity is impacted by social skills. It's also impacted by self-care skills and by an individual's self-esteem and their self-concept of each other. People with physical and developmental disabilities are interested in having a social life. But there may be problems communicating effectively with their bodies. They may have a hard time reading another person's body language. This becomes especially apparent when we get to middle school and junior high and high school, when there are a lot more unspoken social rules and social nuances. And that can also be really challenging for individuals when they're trying to navigate relationships. I know for some kids, when they're in elementary school, they've got these friends, these people that want to sit with them at lunch, want to help them out. And then all of a sudden in middle school and junior high and high school, maybe they don't have as many people wanting to do that because those individuals have moved on with their life, or they've made new friends, or they're more concerned about, their social stature. So those are things that we need to bear in mind when we're, interacting with the person that we love or that we're supporting, that those are things that we're probably going through. Again, difficulty reading others' emotions and intentions can lead to social confusion and also result in poor social problem solving. I'm going to tell a couple of stories as we go through here and try to give some examples of what we've seen over the years and how we've tried to support individuals. So the hidden curriculum, if you haven't heard about it, it's one of those curriculums that has been developed that was specific to the autism population. But when you look at it and when you really read it, if you're working with somebody who struggles with social skills, it's going to apply. And if they struggle like reading the social situation or reading the context or reading the room, this is going to apply. So the hidden curriculum is that unspoken social skills that is elusive. It differs across age. It differs across gender. It differs depending on who you're with. It differs across cultures, and it differs across environments. And if you're having a hard time just interacting with your peer group in a structured setting, think about how more difficult it can be in these different situations. So for example, we had to start working really intentionally with an 11 and 12-year-old because he wanted to sit on everyone's lap. And up until that elusive age of 10, when he got too big, everybody had let him sit on his lap. They would pick him up. He was smaller in stature. They would carry him. And it really started to impact, his functioning in day-to-day environments because he was trying to sit on people's lap that it wasn't appropriate. And he was becoming a teenager and he was starting to have erections, and it was really making it uncomfortable for everyone. So we needed to start working on that. It was hard. And for a kid who didn't have a lot of language, it was hard for him to understand that as well. But we had to identify what are some ways that he can show affection that is appropriate, and what are some ways that we can show him affection. Or is it maybe we need to say, like, the only place that you sit on mom's lap are in these environments, just so, again, we're not, making him stand out or making him not be included because of these different behaviors that are not appropriate for a teenager to engage in. There's some really specific examples throughout the hidden curriculum. This book is like $20 and it is a good read. I really enjoy it and I've used it throughout my career. But being a good listener, smiling and looking interested in topics that you're not interested in, asking about the other person's interests in order to engage someone in a conversation and start that relationship. Complimenting people. This is a big piece of building relationships with people, is making sure that you notice what they're good at. And, if they are wearing a new shirt and things like that, people like to hear that. Phone and social media etiquette, that's a whole training, and we're going to try to hit some of it. Flirting, which, oh my goodness gracious, there's a couple curriculums I'm going to reference throughout that actually have lesson plans on flirting and how to flirt. So, and then recovering when something goes wrong. If there's one thing that I've noticed throughout my career, it's that one of the differences I've noticed between a typical person and someone who has a developmental disability or a mental health diagnosis is that a typical person seems to be able to recover when they make a misstep. So if they say, when are you expecting, to someone who's not pregnant, whereas another individual, an individual with a developmental disability who doesn't have as much of a diverse skill set, might really struggle in that situation and may feel like it's, they've ruined everything and they're never going to be able to talk to that person again. So really teaching people how to recover when something goes wrong and giving them scripts or giving them, cues or things that they can do and say in those situations can be so very helpful. If they've accidentally insulted someone. So the hidden curriculum, one of the examples that TJ and I provide is the concept of the use of the bathroom, the public restroom, okay? And so TJ usually starts it off by asking the men in the room, and I don't think there's many men in the room. So you go into a public restroom and there's 3 urinals, all right? And you see that there's someone at this urinal, right? And these 2 are vacant. Which one, as a man who's been, trained specifically to do this, do you go to? And all the men in the room typically say, you go to this one. You never go to a urinal that's directly next to one that's being occupied. And then we ask everyone in the room, who taught you that? Did you learn that in a class? Did your parents sign you up for a class that taught you, where to go in a public bathroom? And then on the flip side, for my ladies out there, we know in a lot of social settings, when you go to a public bathroom, you rarely go alone, especially if you're with other girls. When you go into the bathroom, you get into stalls next to each other. And if you're thinking of like a club environment, you're putting lipstick, you're sharing toilet paper, you're talking about the other girl's shoes in the other stall, and it's a really social setting. So it's a completely different environment. And again, we're not taught that. That's something that we learn over time through context and through observation and what I like to call osmosis. You just suck in these social skills over time that we have to sit down and teach our kids directly so that they don't get themselves in a dangerous or uncomfortable situation. So that's just an example of the hidden curriculum and all the skills that are out there that it can be a little overwhelming at times when we realize sometimes how much we do need to teach. So with relationships, there's a curriculum I'm going to reference here, and it's Intimate Relationships and Sexual Health, and it's by Melissa Doobie. It's a great curriculum. It actually is lesson plans. You can take this curriculum and hand it to your teacher, your intervention specialist, or your therapist, or whoever's providing that support, and ask them to work on specific concepts. It goes from social skills to physical anatomy, to relationships, to dating, to safety. So, but one of the things that I really like in here for relationships are the stages of friendship and the stages of romantic relationships. So again, when there are so many nuances in the social world and in the world of relationships, it provides us these stages with a concrete way of teaching some of those things. And we all know that the real world is not black and white, but sometimes when we start teaching, we have to start teaching in that black and white way to be able to then explain the nuances, and that makes it a little bit easier to understand. And I'm going to show an example of one of the stages. What this does is it helps you to understand when to move to the next stage and an appropriate timeline for doing so. And sometimes there's actually a timeline worksheet where you can work this out with the individual you're working with. So how long have you known this person? What kind of information have you shared? And then you talk about what's appropriate as a next step. And again, it's just important to have these really intentional and direct conversations. Moving too fast and moving too slow can be a problem for anyone, right? And it's really hard to know that, especially if you have a hard time reading those nonverbals or reading the room, like I said before. But there's a couple of different resources I'm going to show you in these next pages. And one of them is a circles curriculum, and that can also describe those different stages of relationships and what's appropriate to do, what's not appropriate to do, what's appropriate to share in terms of information, what's not appropriate to share, what kind of touch to engage in with those different levels as well. So it's a nice black and white curriculum. So here's an example. So this is just an example. I pulled this from the good old interwebs, and you can see that there's 3 parts to this curriculum. Part 1 is social distance. Part 2 is relationship building, and part 3 is sexuality education. And you can see down at the bottom, that's what the curriculum really looks like. It's actually a circle with concentric circles. And on the outside is the stranger circle. On the inside is the private circle, and you can see how it moves from there. And the Doobie curriculum also uses these circles, but in a different way, and you'll see that slide as well. So in the circles curriculum, you can see the red circle. So at the top middle, it says it may be a red circle area if 1, I'm outside of my home or school. 2, I see someone or lots of other people I don't know. 3, these people don't know my mom and dad. So what we do with this curriculum is we modify it to make it make sense to the individual that we're supporting, right? So everyone's going to use this a little bit differently, but this is a really good start for people who have not started having these conversations. And social distance is a good one to just begin with the concepts of safety before we move on to relationship building, because it's really important to talk about safety before we do that. Here's the example of stages of friendships. I know that it is very hard to read, and this is the book that I was referencing. So Intimate Relationships and Sexual Health, a curriculum for teaching adolescents and adults with high functioning autism spectrum disorders or other social challenges. So again, there's so many curriculums and resources that I'm going to reference and that are in that resource guide that are going to be specific to a disability. But I can tell you that TJ and I throughout the years have pulled indiscriminately from all of these to support different diagnoses. And it really doesn't, like, there's very few, unless you have a kid who has, a medical condition, that is going to be so specific that it only relates to people on the autism spectrum. So I'm going to lean in here and try to read this. So if I make funny faces. So this is the stages of friendships. So one is self-intimacy. So that's the very center circle, the most private. And it says, this innermost circle consists of you and you only. All right. Deep friendship is circle 2. It takes much longer to reach this stage. You have experienced each other closely for so long that you trust each other deeply. That's an example of what's written in there. I'm going to jump to casual acquaintances. It says you still don't know each other well enough to share personal information. You share feelings and thoughts, but only positive ones about non-controversial topics. And then that circle 5, the strangers one, it says you begin to share information on a superficial level, revealing no personal or private information. If you both respond positively, you may advance to the next circle. I know it sounds like a board game, but it has been very useful in helping the individuals that we serve. And we use a variety of curriculums in the sex ed classes that we teach at the children's home, but this is pretty much one of the backbones of that curriculum for the kids that can access it. The circles curriculum we use and we adapt for our kids that might have less language or not as strong in reading, because it's a much more heavy in the visual curriculum than the Doobie. So another part of this book, the Doobie book, it actually talks about the best places to go meet someone and go on a date. Talks about the fact that it's important to do an activity that interests you and is a shared interest, somewhere to go with a safe, familiar atmosphere, a place where you can see clearly, hear clearly, and respond to what the other person says. And then parties or social events in a group are also a really great place to go meet somebody. So we talk about, so specifically with an individual who might have like significant sensory issues, probably don't want to go to, the county fair on your first date, because you're going to be processing so much stimuli and so much information that it's going to be hard for you to have a successful interaction with the person that you're with. So where can we go that is a safe, supportive environment that will also allow you to focus? Movies are really popular, but you can't really talk to someone at a movie. Restaurants can be a little bit distracting. So it's important to brainstorm with the person that you're supporting to identify a place that they're going to have the most successful first experience or ongoing dates and experiences. Sometimes a park is a really nice place. We do say that places to avoid looking for friends in a date are bars, the job, the office, your immediate neighborhood, and similar places. And I cannot tell you how much resistance I've gotten from this. And just recently I was talking to a former student who is in a relationship, and he was sharing, my mom and dad met at their job and this person met at their job because he had just started dating somebody that he worked with. And I said, I understand, like, there's a lot of people that do meet their significant other at their job, or they might meet at a bar. It's not the most ideal situation. If, for example, at the job or the office, if you break up, then you still have to continue to see and interact with that person. And that can make it really awkward and difficult, and especially difficult to recover from a relationship breakup. So those are just some of the black and white ways. And like I said, we introduce this curriculum in a black and white way, and then we meet the kids wherever they are, and we speak to those nuances. We try to explain those nuances. Where to start? This is one of the curriculums. This is a newer one. It's called Sexuality and Relationship Education for Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorder. So again, I want you to look at this. If you can see the slide, is there anything on that slide that makes you think that this is only for a kid with autism? No, this is a great comprehensive checklist that you can start to look at to see, where do I prioritize when I start talking with my kid? I'm not going to be able to talk to them about the whole concept of puberty. I'm not going to be able to talk to them about the whole concept of relationships, but how am I going to prioritize? So it talks about public and private. It talks about safety skills. It goes on. There's multiple pages. And if you're wondering where to start, I would recommend this being one of those places. I think the book is about $45 on Amazon, this sexuality assessment. Another assessment that I really like, and a lot of schools will have access to this, is the Parents of Teenagers Survival Checklist. I actually found an updated version of this, and you'll see it's even broader. I cut and paste this area because it was around health in grooming and sexuality, but it actually goes into home maintenance and navigating the community. And you can do this on a regular basis. The different columns help you do it every year so that you can assess, is my child or the person I support making progress in these specific areas? So, it says, do they recognize the symptom of a cold? Do they know how to treat a minor burn? Do they know when to decide to go to the doctor? Those are some of the examples in the top area. The importance of using deodorant, the importance of clean clothing and shoes. Those are also different areas that are in this checklist. So there's a couple of different resources that can help you to start identify, where do I start talking with the person I'm supporting about puberty and about relationships. Do we have any questions so far?
They were just asking about the author of the Intimate Relationships book that you mentioned, and also the hidden curriculum. So I put the answers to that in the chat box and reminded everybody that this information is also all downloaded on the Google Salt drive.
Yes, great. And if there's anything that you're looking for, there are so many more resources, but we try to keep it down to 2 pages. I think it's still 2 pages, just in an effort not to overwhelm. But over the almost 10 years we've been doing this presentation, we've gathered quite a few resources. So if you're looking for anything specific, please do let me know. All right, I'm trying to go back and click. All right, we're going to talk about sexuality. And this is the gender unicorn. So this is an area that has expanded quite a bit over the years that we've been doing this presentation, just because the topic of sexuality has expanded so much. And that does not exclude anybody with a diagnosis or developmental disability. That still includes individuals who have a diagnosis. So, and we have witnessed, like I said, I've witnessed over the years, kids going through this and trying to experiment and trying to change their clothes and their looks. And it is a very typical thing to go through. And what I've noticed, and this is anecdotal, but as a parent and as an educator who's been doing this for a while, is that kids are doing it at a younger age because it is more socially acceptable and it's out there in the community and people are seeing it. So our kids are starting to feel more comfortable expressing themselves, and that can change over the years quite a bit. That can change. Kids can feel really strongly that they want to dress this particular way, and that will last for 2 or 3 years, and for other kids it might last forever. I had a goal when I was a preteen of being able to dress myself, because my mom had dressed me for so long and I had very specific clothes that looked just like her clothes. And I couldn't wait until I could just wear t-shirts and jeans. And that was my goal. And by the time I had gotten to the 6th grade, I had a wardrobe that was almost all t-shirt and jeans. And guess what? I still prefer to wear t-shirts and jeans. It's still my preferred wardrobe. So there's nothing better than getting home from a long day and getting out of this business casual stuff.
Amanda,
so, yes.
Back when you were discussing the assessments, we have somebody who asked, is there a source that they can pay to conduct an assessment? It may seem like a lame request, but I don't think so, Tish, it isn't. But I need more objectivity. When the schools do something like this, they just give me a blank form and say, fill this out.
Yeah, I actually do have a list. So a couple of years ago, the Regional Autism Advisory Council hosted a whole entire training series just around sexuality and relationships. And I have a whole entire list of practitioners, certified sexuality educators and people, and I'm happy to share that list. That's what it's for. And there might be individuals that are willing to do that. If you are working with a private therapist, it might be something that if you can find an assessment, they might be able to be the ones who complete it. But yeah, I can provide that list. So I'll make a note here to do that. Thankfully, there are more and more resources out there. When TJ and I first started doing this presentation, there are very few. We had Colleen Mercurio Johnson, who was in Butler County, and we had Heidi Nunemaker, who was working at Vision at the time. I mean, there's literally like 2 or 3 people that were comfortable enough to have these conversations. So I'm going to make sure I send that therapist list to you guys. All right. You would think I know what I'm doing with Zoom by now. So people with developmental disabilities are often seen as, and this is from the outside perspective, as asexual, sexually naive, or sexually deviant. I shared the statistic before that NPR investigation revealed that adults were more than 7 times more likely to be sexually abused or experience sexual trauma. And unfortunately, children with disabilities are also sexually abused at a rate that is about 2.2 times higher than children without disabilities. And knowledge is power here. And this is what I'm toting, and I've been toting it this whole time, and I'll continue to do it. The more knowledge we can give our kids, the less scared we can be, and the less scared they can be, and the more empowered they can be to make these decisions. Individuals with developmental disabilities do have sexual desires and are exposed to sexually based materials. So again, it comes down to a lot of times, do you want the environment to be the one who guides your kids' understanding of sexuality, or do you want to have a part in that? And it is uncomfortable, but every single family is going to be very different in how they approach this and what they accept and what they don't accept, right? And what they want their kids to talk about and what they want their kids to, not talk about. So this is where we need our families to influence what is being taught and how it's being taught. We teach general content. And like I said, over the 10 years that we've been teaching sex education at the Children's Home and in that program, the Heights Center specifically, we have only had, I think, a total of 5 kids over those years asked to opt out. And when they ask to opt out, it's not from the whole entire curriculum. It's from a particular portion of that curriculum, right? It might be specific to contraception, or it might be specific to, STIs or things like that. So it's really important for us to make sure that our kids are getting access, and our young adults and our adults. TJ and I were asked to present to the Down Syndrome Association several years ago to a group of adults, and it was going to be young adults, but it ended up being 18 to 40-year-olds. And what we realized was that there were a lot of people in that room that had never had this kind of education. And we had come in with these big ideas of what we were going to present. And we really had to back it down and just focus on safety and just focus on body rights, because a lot of the individuals in the room had never even been exposed to that. And again, it's because a lot of times their families didn't see them as sexual beings. We are all sexual beings. We all go through this. We all go through these different periods of times in our life, and our bodies do things automatically and separately from our brains a lot of times. So again, parents and professionals are often pessimistic about the potential of their children with disabilities being able to have and enjoy intimacy and sexuality. And it can be scary. And I understand that it's very scary, especially, I know there's a lot of parents that we work with that have girls with disabilities, and there's a lot of fear there because, with boys, they can get someone pregnant, but having a girl who actually goes through the pregnancy is a completely different experience. And it is very scary. A lot of fear that talking about this stuff is going to encourage it. But however, talking about it is really going to make you and your child better prepared with safety skills and help make better decisions about those relationships and about intimacy. How can you make a decision about who a safe partner is if you've never talked about being in a relationship, right? So if you suddenly find yourself, you have an 18-year-old who's just dived right into the world of dating and you've never talked to them about what a safe partner is, you can't necessarily expect that child to use the positive examples, right? They're going to use all the examples. When we were teaching sex ed the first year, I remember one of the boys was just really focused on having sex, and he really wanted to have sex, and he was asking us how he could go about having sex. And his example and what was inspiring him was the Jersey Shore. And if you remember that show, it was a disturbing show for me anyway. I know a lot of people enjoyed it, but I mean, it showed a lot of these kids engaging in, a lot of intimate relations, switching partners and having different boys and girlfriends and being promiscuous. And again, like, that was an example to him, and we had to back it up to talk about that was not actually how everybody engaged in relationships. And that was just one TV show that was sensationalizing those relationships and their sexual experiences. So some of the things that we talk about with sexuality, so when we take it again down to where do we even start? A lot of times you have to start with the biological and physical aspects of the reproductive system, right? So you actually have to talk about the fact that a penis is not just for urinating, and a penis is also for pleasure. There are different functions for a penis. There are different things that come out of a penis. And that, again, that is just really important for us to tell the individuals that we work with, so that when they have those experiences, they don't feel like they're sick. They don't feel like they've done something terrible. They don't have to deal with those emotions without any sort of base of knowledge, right? So it's important for us to talk about the body functions and the names and reproducing those, distinguishing those things as well from other body parts. When I worked with younger kids, I worked with a kid who is about 6 years old, who had been identified of having Asperger's at the time. And I remember him being sick and being ill. And he was trying to tell us that he didn't feel good. And he kept pointing to his mouth. And he was like, my mouth doesn't feel good. My mouth doesn't feel good. And what it came down to actually was that he had strep throat, and he didn't have the word for throat. Nobody had ever talked about a throat with him, right? So he just was trying to say the closest thing. A more disturbing story that you'll hear if you check out those NPR articles is a woman that had actually, it turned out that she had been raped, and she did not have language, a lot of language, and she kept pointing to her stomach and saying that her stomach hurt. And when they took her to the hospital, they found out that she had been raped, and she didn't have the terminology for it. Again, she didn't know what a vagina was. She didn't know what a penis was. She didn't have that vocabulary to be able to advocate for her. So again, I know it's scary, and I know that the words make us uncomfortable, but it is the most important thing that we can do to empower the people that we're working with. Scientific terminology is important. As our kids, again, get older, it's important to start moving to the use of more age-appropriate language as well. So not, referring to their penis as, a TT or a Tata, and, actually using the actual terminology. And that's so that, again, they can advocate for themselves, but so they can also fit in with their peers, and so that people don't use that terminology against them as well. There's a whole entire lesson plan in that Doobie curriculum that goes through slang. And some of you will be completely disturbed by it. Some of you will be amused by it, but it goes through all the terminology and the different slang words for penis, for boobs, for vagina, for intercourse. And again, that is so that we're empowering our kids not to use it, but to be aware of it so that people don't use it against us, right? If somebody is calling a kid a name that is actually sexual slang, it's important for them to understand what is being said. So again, features and functions, and then talking about private and public. The picture you see down here in the bottom right is an actual, it's called Teach Bodies, and you can purchase these to teach about an anatomy. This is really good for especially individuals that may not have a lot of language. You can ask them to point to different body parts. You can point and teach them, pubic hair, nipples, different body parts on an anatomically correct figure. So those are really expensive. So if anybody knows how to knit or something, I'd recommend doing that, or just use pictures, or y'all, I know y'all have been creative, and you can continue to use that to teach these different skills. Again, we talked about the sexuality assessment. So some of the things that we talk about in the sexuality assessment are names of body parts, making sure that the individuals that we're working with have an understanding of what those names are. It can get really detailed. A couple of years ago, we had a news station coming to do some sort of a highlight on the Height Center. And I was walking around the different classrooms and basically putting Post-it notes in the classrooms on the ones that the newsroom could go into, and the one that they couldn't go into. And I remember walking to a classroom that had 6 boys and a teacher and a smart board, and there was a gigantic erect penis on the smart board. And I was like, oh my gosh, like we cannot. And they were going through all the different, foreskin, and they were going through, the scrotum, and talking about all those different body parts. And I remember the boys looking at me with amusement, and I was just like, oh, I'm going to tell the news guys that they can't go in here. And they're like, no, tell them to come in. It'll be great. So it's hard to do it to a Zoom audience, guys. I need like some canned laughter or something so I get some reinforcement for my behavior. So again, understanding the relationships and stages, talking about good touch and bad touch. Sometimes that has to be, again, in a really concrete way. So some curriculums will tell you to use the bathing suit. So if, the body part is underneath underneath where your bathing suit would go, that would be considered a private place, right? That's a place that's a no touch place for a stranger. And then talking about places where it's okay for someone to touch it, because we don't want our kids to be too defensive in a doctor's office, right? Again, the hidden curriculum around sexuality, who to talk to about this. It's so important to identify trusted people. Again, I don't expect my daughter to come to talk to me about her sex life or her physical relationships. I didn't call my parents when I lost my virginity. That was not the first person that I picked up the phone and called. We talked to safe people that we can relate to and know that they're not going to judge us or tell us what we're doing is wrong, and who are going to give us guidance and advice that doesn't feel like they're being overprotective. So it's important to try to find someone outside of your family circle who they can talk to, who can be that trusted person. There is nothing more powerful to me than when I found out that my daughter was talking to one of my close friends. And my close friend called me and was just like, hey, she reached out to me and she wanted to talk about some stuff. And I said, as long as it's not an issue of care and safety and welfare, as long as she's not endangering herself or someone else, like, I really appreciate that she has an outlet and someone safe to talk to. And that if that person actually happens also to be my friend, it made me feel a lot better. And we were going through some pretty tough times at that time. So knowing that she had someone to talk to made me feel so much better, because sometimes our kids are not going to come to us. Whether we want it or not, right? So safety skills, and we're going to get into that a little bit, being responsible, and then self-advocating and being able to say no. So those are all things that we want to assess and see what the baseline is with the individuals that we're serving. Some other topics to review and prioritize just based on who your kid is or who the person you're serving is. Consent. Again, a whole entire training. I could go into a whole entire training, but the moral of the story with consent, you'll hear me say this again, is that it's really important that we start teaching choice from a very young age. And I started out in behavior analysis. I started working at CCA, pretty young. And I look back and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have known then what I know now about compliance and over compliance. It's so important for us to allow our kids to say no and to empower them to say no. And sometimes that's around, I think a good starting place sometimes would be around broccoli, right? Like if they don't want to eat broccoli, can we empower them by letting them say no to the broccoli? What a lovely thing. That is a choice. They see other people in their world making those choices, and it can be very confusing if they're not allowed to make those choices. If they aren't allowed to wear certain clothes to school, but they see other people wearing those clothes to school, that's where people can get confused and get frustrated a lot of times because they're not being provided with choice in their life. So again, consent is really around choice. And that's how we start early, is choosing our battles and identifying what are the times, what are the situations where I can allow my kid to say no to me or to someone else, and I can empower them by allowing them to say no and acknowledging that and not trying to force them to be compliant. So, and that's the same thing in a school setting, and going back and making sure that we're embedding those choices in school as well. So an example, and this is a non-sexual example, but there is a student that I worked with that had some pretty significant self-regulation issues, but he had made so much progress. I'd known him since he was in second grade. I think this situation was when he was a sophomore, I think. And he got really mad because his transportation was late for picking him up. He hated being the last person at school, and he took his Tupperware container and he threw it against the wall, and SpaghettiOs just splattered all over the wall, right? And so I feel like a lot of people immediately go to a punitive response to that. And yes, I walked into the room and I was like, you are going to clean that up. You made that mess. And he felt remorseful immediately. It wasn't that he wasn't remorseful, is that it was not, holding himself back from making that decision in the first place. And so we sat down afterwards the next day, because he, like I said, his transportation was already late. I wasn't going to make him wait any longer having this conversation. And I told him we were going to have the conversation. And I said, you're right. You have the choice to throw your Tupperware container. You're absolutely right. I can't tell him he can't do that. He can do it. He did do it, right? So yes, you can actually do that. You can throw your Tupperware container, but here's the consequences of that. Whereas here are some other options of what you can do the next time you're frustrated, in providing them again with the choices. And sometimes one of those choices that you present is going to be the one that you don't want them to make. But just validating that it is a choice, especially if you have someone who's a black and white thinker who has a really specific logic, really makes them feel like you're acknowledging the truth and you're acknowledging the reality of what day-to-day living is. Again, menstruation, contraception, pregnancy and childbirth, talking about these things with boys and with girls, all of these things with boys and girls. And again, the reason why, another story, we had a 16-year-old boy who had just started in our program, didn't have a lot of language, but he did have some language. He was in a sex ed class, and I was like his safe person and one that he wanted to talk to about this. And long story short, basically what he expressed to me is that he thought he was going to have his period. Nobody had actually sat down with him and told him that menstruation was something that only happened with women. So he had been so anxious and upset, worrying that this was going to happen to him. And he also did not know that he did not have a vagina. Like, again, this is something that no one had sat down and talked to him about. He was 16 years old, nobody had ever sat down and talked to him about it. So he didn't, through process of elimination, through common sense, whatever you want to call it, he didn't know what he didn't know, right? So masturbation and then cleanliness and health. And again, masturbation, I know that it could be an entire topic of itself. I really hope that RAC brings that sexuality training back, because they had specific speakers talking about these very specific topics. They had a whole entire thing about menstruation with ladies from Children's Hospital. And if you have girls, any of you have girls, the DDPP clinic, actually, there is a gynecological clinic at Children's Hospital, and they do make modifications for individuals with developmental disabilities. They will talk families through menstruation. They'll talk through, hormones and how to, slow down menstruation, how to put kids on birth control and what works for every kid. They will talk to you about different, different feminine hygiene products that'll work for your kids. So there are a lot of resources out there if you're looking for them. So please, again, don't hesitate to reach out. One of the most important things we talk about in sexuality at the end of it is privacy circles. And we go through those privacy circles to talk about the different vocabulary, the different topics. And we say, with whom is this appropriate to talk to? All right. I can talk to myself about it. I can talk to my brother about it. This is what I want to talk to about with my parents. Here are some different people that I should talk to. Everybody else, not, these are the topics that I can talk about. So it might be just like an innocuous thing like, did you see The Bachelor last night, right? But we're not going to be talking about masturbation with somebody in the Kroger's line. The same thing with, you can use the privacy circles for location as well. So where's an appropriate place to talk about this versus not an appropriate place to talk about it. And when we were running those sessions at the Down Syndrome Association, they had this huge, giant whiteboard wall that I just loved. And if we were in person, I'd be moving all over the place. I'm sitting on a yoga ball right now, but I'd be moving all over the place and writing and giving you graphs and examples. So I'm sad that I can't do that. But we actually drew the privacy circles every single time we had a session. And at the end of every session, we would get Post-it notes, and we would put different words and different topics and different places and different people. And we would have the individuals that we were working with actually take the Post-it notes and interact and do it. And for some people that, are kind of multimodal learners, that's a really good way for that information to sink in. And we did it every single time. There's an example of the privacy circles. I mean, you saw it with the stages of friendship. You saw it with the circles curriculum. You can make it yourself on the computer. You can draw it on a wall. You can put it on a shirt. There's so many ways that you can use this to try to guide those conversations, because what's important for us to do when we're talking about this with the individuals we're working with is not to say it's good or bad, but to talk about public and private, okay, not okay, where it's okay and where it's not okay. Because if you tell someone again that it's not okay to talk about this, and then they turn on the TV and it's Jersey Shore, then you've just discredited yourself, right? Or you frustrated the person that you're interacting with because they feel like you don't think that they have the right to the same amount of knowledge, right? So there's a lot of different ways to look at that, but it's really important, instead of us trying to protect, to create safe and natural boundaries, natural supports as much as possible, and to teach, teach, teach. Here's a couple of resources. So again, an estimated 3 to 5 million LGBT people also have disabilities. It goes into those different categories, and there's a whole entire slideshow at the end if this is something that you're interested in. It even has like modified clothing for individuals that are in wheelchairs and want to dress in a different way or want to express themselves in a different way. So lots of resources that are growing every single day. The Gender Unicorn, this is a training that we went through at the Children's Home. And I got to tell you, like, I feel like I'm a pretty, I've been exposed to a lot throughout my career, and I'm still learning, and I still haven't gotten all of this down, and I still make missteps when it comes to what gender identity is versus gender expression. The Gender Unicorn is a great visual resource for me to be able to understand what those different terms mean. And they're always updating this to make sure that it's as current as possible as well. So again, if this is something that you're interested in, if this is something that you're working with a teen or a young adult and they need someone to explain this to them, because it can be very confusing. You talk about social missteps, right? If you say he and it's actually she, how do you just account for that in your brain, and how do you move forward, and how do you apologize when you do that? So this is just another resource. Here's some more sexuality assessments. So I shared that I was going to share some of these. Some of these are free, some of these have a cost. If you contact those sexuality resources, the therapists and the educators, you might ask them what assessments they have available and if they have any of these. The ones in the books that I'd referenced before, those are included in the book. So you can just, Xerox them, talk about old school. Yeah, Xerox them, and then you can fill them out as many times as you like or as many times as you need. All right, social media, how am I doing? Woo, all right, get ready. You thought I was talking fast before. So social media is here, I think, to probably stay. And a lot of our kids are starting to access it in ways that they never, we never had to deal with ourselves as parents and as teenagers, right? So it's a learning curve for us, but it's one of those things, again, that I've seen, I've observed, I've supported families that want to eliminate this. And it's just like putting your finger in a dam. If you put your finger in one spot, it's probably, there's going to be a hole in another spot. So if your kid is really obsessed and trying to seek social media and trying to connect with people online, it's harder to stop it than to shape it, is what I'm trying to say, and trying to put boundaries on it and trying to expose kids to what is appropriate. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons of that. This is usually TJ's section that he goes over. And again, he's done a whole entire presentation just on social media. So if you want more resources, please send them our way. And TJ is happy to provide support, even though he's not here today. The most popular social media platforms of 2021, no big surprise there, right? Oh, every time I click on something else, there we go. So there we go. Other forms of social media that I think that we don't always think of are video games, mobile games, YouTube, FaceTime, various messaging apps. There are ways to interact. And if a kid really wants to interact, I mean, there's so many platforms for doing that, but our kids are getting online. They're interacting with people they've never met before via video games, sometimes in mobile games. They can have interactions in the comment boxes of YouTube. They can share videos. They can share, YouTube channels with each other. There's so many ways that kids are interacting with, and people are interacting with each other. What's not considered social media is assistive devices, watching TV or movies, learning or communication apps, and video games that are played offline, and that is an option. So there's a couple of different types of social media use. Active, which is where we're regularly sharing life experiences, create and share content, engage with others. This is what TJ always refers to as me, because I'm the one on Facebook that's posting and updating, I just went and saw this movie, or I'm posting if I'm at a concert. And TJ is the passive one. Like I always joke around in our presentation that if I get a like from TJ, that's big time, because he usually doesn't even like things. He just strolls and observes only, but he rarely creates or engages. So passive is actually the most common form of social media use. And it's also been associated with higher levels of anxiety and depression when we're just watching it and we're not engaging and interacting. Oh. So the pros of social media use, there's a lot of pros. It requires less decoding of complex social information. So one of the things that I learned when I was working in that, the adults with autism support group. And I learned so much from that group. I cannot even tell you how much, but there is an individual that says, it's not that I can't, understand tone of voice and facial expressions and body language in context. It's that I can't do it in the nanosecond required to be identified as typical. It takes me time. Sometimes, like my life, and this is a person saying that, is looking back and saying, oh, I wish I would have said that. I wish I would have done that. Because this girl actually was able to process the information. She just wasn't able to do it in that blip of a second. So being on social media allows us to take our time and read through those interactions, and it gives us more time to decode them as well. So specific to autism, and then he just pulled some research here, social media use is actually associated with high friendship quality in adolescents, although this is impacted by their level of anxiety. So individuals with a higher level of anxiety might have more trouble interacting socially, and that has nothing to do with autism. That has more to do with anxiety, right? And social media may help a lot of adolescents actually improve the quality of their friendships. I think as a parent, I knew that it was really uncomfortable for me when my daughter started interacting with people that, she had never met, that were not at school. And I just had to accept over time that this is becoming more and more normal. And what was important for me was to bust into a room while she was having those conversations and make sure I saw I'm just kidding. I did. Okay. So I'm not a perfect parent, but I did bust into the room when I heard her talking to a young man who had a super low voice, and I thought it was a man. And it turned out she showed me, she turned the screen around, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're a baritone. More pros, so their interactions, the interactions are free of the burdens of face-to-face encounters. So for a lot of the individuals that we work with, those face-to-face encounters they might be, because they are self-conscious about the way that they look, the way that they talk. It might be because, they just have a lot of anxiety in those social situations. So this can be really free. It's an opportunity for feeling connected with others. They're more limited and distinct emotional reactions. So it can be a little bit more black and white. If somebody puts a frowny face on something, then you're like, hey, I just ticked that person off, And then posts can be reviewed and edited before sharing. Anybody do that? I mean, we always joke around that we think that we should have this presentation for typical people, because we see, again, it's hard when you have a developmental disability, you have a diagnosis, and you continue to see these typical people engaging in things that we're being told not to do. It's just a little frustrating and confusing, but it's nice to be able to go back and delete a post or review it and edit it. I know I review mine for grammatical errors all the time. You can observe the logical progression of a conversation. So for somebody who's really trying to learn about social skills and his social interactions, this is a safe way to watch people interact. You can watch people recover from mistakes that they've made and things that they've said that they shouldn't have said, You can watch using passive social media to learn about the expectations of a group, right? So you can I'm in a group right now. It's called Neurodiverse Affirmative Therapists. I still haven't posted. I haven't responded in a comment because I'm just observing and seeing how this group works, right? Because it seems like there's a really specific way of how you're supposed to interact in the group. Lots of options for shared interests and experiences, and that's so empowering. I think one of the most empowering things about a kid coming to the Heights Center and, to a program that is mostly, right, it's all developmental disabilities, mostly autism. One of the pros of that is that they're connecting with people who are 14 and 15 and still like Thomas the Train. They're connecting with people that have, a encyclopedic knowledge of Pokemon characters. And it's so nice to be able to share those interests with other people. And sometimes, the individuals that we work with are going to have lifelong passions in this. And then professionals can also gain the insight into the concerns and experiences of people with developmental disabilities, not just ASD, but people with developmental disabilities. So, I run a support group, or I run a group on Facebook called the Cincinnati Adults with Autism Network. And there's times that there's not a lot of interaction, and there's times that there's heavy interaction, and it's just really educational for me as a provider. And I have always told the support group when I was a part of it, I said, your experiences and the things that you've taught me in this group has completely and directly impacted the way that this program, the HEIGHT program, has been developed, because there are so many things that they had gone through and frustrations that they had expressed that helped me modify our program, include things like the sex education curriculum, to make sure that we are including these things that they felt like they had not been a part of. Some of the cons, passive use, again, that can lead to feelings of isolation. If you're not interacting with people, you really feel like you're on the outside and you're watching these people get new cars and new dogs and new relationships, and it can feel really isolating. And I think we can all relate to that as well. Potential for being victims of scams. And the last time we did this presentation, I think we had 3 different families follow up with us afterwards, because this is a real issue. And again, my daughter, she came into me laughing because she had someone contact her on Facebook with like money all over the table. And he had used her name and said, Alexis, I can't wait to meet you. And for some individuals who don't understand or haven't been taught, that can lead down a really scary, scary rabbit hole. And then we have worked with individuals that have internet gaming disorder. It's not a formal diagnosis. It's actually being considered by the DSM, which is that, the Bible of diagnoses, basically, because it is becoming such an issue. The more that we rely on computers and the internet, the more kids are having a hard time understanding the boundaries of what to be safe and what's not safe and how much is too much. This is a really good resource. I definitely, thank you for sharing that, Julie. You can chat with people on Pinterest. Yeah, I mean, you can chat with people on all sorts of things. On Instagram, I didn't know that for the longest time until somebody tried to chat with me. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do this. This Touchpoint resource, this is not, again, just for people with autism spectrum disorders, but what it's trying to share is specific resources, right? And, if you have someone who is socially naive or might be, socially delayed, these are things that we really want to talk about, again, very intentionally. So this is a great resource. I would recommend that you go and check this out. And it gives more resources, of course, within, but here are some of the tips that we cut and paste in. So 12 ways to improve social media and online communication. I'm not going to read through these again because we've got very few more minutes and I want to get through safety, but you're going to notice again, you're going to be like, hey, I need to share this with my sister, or I need to share this with my bestie because they are not doing this. Why are they friends with their boss online? So there's just different tips. And again, start with the black and white and then add the gray, add the nuances from there. Safety. All right, so Dave Hinsberger he was a titan of the sexuality movement with people with developmental disabilities. And he actually just passed away this last year, a huge loss to the community. He's got a lot of resources and a lot of articles out there I highly recommend. But he was a huge advocate of this safety circle and how we make sure that the loved one, the person in the center, right here is protected, is that they have these different components. They have someone who listens to them, not someone who tells them, not someone who teaches them, not someone who corrects them, but someone who listens to them. Understanding personal rights, those, again, healthy and self-concept and self-confidence, options for healthy sexuality, again, just providing an outlet, sex education, privacy awareness, and then the ability to non-comply. And then this visual shows that, and it's on here actually, that you can then understand and have the caring others in this circle, helping someone through these different concepts. And that's going to protect them from the people that are going to try to take advantage of them. So this is one of my favorite and the scariest statistic that I have to share with you, but it's important that I share it with you because I feel like can set the individuals we serve up for really bad situations if we don't. 94% of people who are abused or a victim of sexual abuse are by people that they know. And 41% of those are service providers, 24% are family, 20% are friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, 9% are peers, and 6% are strangers. I know that's not a statistic that you want to hear. I know it's not what you want to see, but what's important, again, is to go back to how do we teach body rights? How do we teach safety? How do we teach our kids to advocate for themselves? And when it comes down to it, how do we set them up so that they know how to interact with strangers in a safe way? What happens if our kid is out in the community and an accident happens and they're in peril and we've told them not to talk to strangers, right? We need them to run to someone that is a safe person. We need them to run to the bus driver or the shopkeeper or, the traffic director and ask for help. And those people are strangers. So it's really important for us to really define what that looks like and what those behaviors should be. And that's where those circles curriculums can be really helpful. So this right here, the body rights. So this is from a Down syndrome curriculum. And again, you're going to look at it. It's not specific to Down syndrome. And when we have taught these classes to individuals, when TJ and I've had the opportunity to do that, this is the one thing that we go through every single time, every single session. And for a period of time, we were doing it at the start of the session and at the end of the session. We were having people recite it. We were having individuals that didn't have a lot of language fill in the words with, visuals. We were having people, fill in the blanks. We were having people choose the correct word. We were having them interact with these body rights in so many different ways so that they became really fluent with it. It's so important that we teach them so that they're safe and they expect people to respect their personal space, but also on the flip side, we really need to make sure that the individuals we serve are doing the same thing for someone else. These body rights are not just your body rights, they're everyone's body rights, okay? And this just talks about, again, teachings explicitly and about how to avoid sexual predators, how to reduce the risk of becoming a victim of sexual crime, but also on the other side, how to avoid being identified as a sexual predator. I've actually had to deal with this on multiple times where the kid doesn't know when to stop calling. They don't know when to stop texting. And they're really starting to harass someone to the point where they can have charges filed against them. They can be expelled from, a college program. Like there's a lot of different things. So this is one of those recovery mechanisms down here. So if someone tells you that you are harassing them, you stop the behavior. If you're unsure of what you're actually doing, ask for clarification, apologize. And then if the person who felt harassed requests it, stay away. So there's just different tips. This is in the DUBIE curriculum, again, that DUBIE curriculum. So again, with safety, creating a safe environment and providing your kids with the skills they need to be safe. It's not about avoiding, but about understanding and establishing those boundaries. So being explicit around things like, I don't like people to touch me, and being okay saying that and also having to respect that. And that's something, I'm a super physically affectionate person. And that's something that I've had to learn over the years, especially as I've been providing these trainings, is that there's a lot of kids that, I might touch them and they're like, please don't touch me. And I have to be like, don't take it personally. They don't like to be touched. Make sure you respect it, right? It's really important to empower that. So when we're developing relationships, we're having relationships, in order to be in a safe relationship, you need to be with someone who respects your boundaries. And in relationships, there are so many individual factors and personal preferences. And again, this is something that maybe you're not going to talk about with your kid. Maybe your provider might talk with your kid, but identifying yourself. So that sexual identity, again, that gender identity, knowing your sensory things. So maybe some kids might never want to kiss someone on the lips because it's just a sensory thing. And they might be in a relationship with someone and they have to identify, hey, I don't like to be kissed on the lips. And that other person has to be okay with that. Triggers, whether that be scents, whether that be touch, whether that be lights, whether that be movies or shows, and just any other idiosyncratic needs. In order to be in a safe relationship, you need to be in a relationship where people respect your boundaries and where you're comfortable and where you're not comfortable. This is one of my favorite for consent acronyms. So the FRIES acronym. So when we're teaching consent to the kids that we work with, consent is always freely given. There's no quid pro quo. It's not, if you do this, I will do that. It's freely given. You want to provide your consent. It's always reversible. And this is something I'm going to tell you, and I've talked to college kids about this. I've talked to anybody. Not everybody understands that. You can start making out with somebody and start getting really hot and heavy, and you have the right to change your mind. You have the right to decide you do not want to have sex. You have the right to decide that you want to go home. It's absolutely reversible. If you're in a consensual situation, your desires are reversible, right? It's informed. And informed means that you understand the decision that you're making, right? So if you're having sex, you know that there is a risk to have to get pregnant, even if you're on birth control, right? Even if the person that you're with is on birth control. And when I work with boys, I always say, you have to protect yourself. You can never rely on another person or another girl. Girls miss their birth control. They skip their birth control. There are so many things that impact the efficacy of birth control. You have to control what you can control, and that is a condom. or a vasectomy for older guys. Enthusiastic. So again, consent is enthusiastic. Somebody shouldn't be going into it, like nervous and I know we do, I know we all do, but there still should be like a level of enthusiasm and engagement that someone wants to engage in this interaction, whether it be hand holding, kissing, making out, groping, whatever base you're on, this consent applies. And it should also be specific. And when I say specific, I'm referencing what I just said. What base are we talking about, right? So if we have consent, it's not that you have this blanket consent. It's that you have agreed, this is what I'm comfortable doing. This is where I'm, comfortable going in this relationship. And there's plenty of other acronyms, but this, like I said, it's one of my favorite, and the Fry picture is super cute. Some additional thoughts on safety. It's really important if you're working with a kid that's under 18, start considering including education and the implications of turning 18 as it relates to behaviors and activities. There are things that you can do when you're younger than 18 that you cannot do when you're older than 18 without some repercussions. We work with that with our boys a lot of times when they turn 18 because the age of consent in Ohio is 16. So if they're dating someone who's 14 or 15, they run the risk of being charged as a pedophile, as a sexual predator. And that's really just up to the families and the relationship with the families. And, if the parents are not on board with the relationship, that's a very real risk. And there's all sorts of other things around safety with computer, with accessing things online. Again, I have a whole entire training about online access and pornography and the dangers and how to avoid those things, right? Instead of good and bad, really, which place subjective judgment on thoughts and behaviors, focus more on objective concepts such as safe and dangerous, private and public. You're going to get a lot more buy-in with your teen or with your young adult or with your older adult if you talk about it in those terms, because there's way too many examples of people engaging in things that you've identified as bad and that they think is okay, right? We had a parent at one point that discovered her son was into pornography, had been exploring pornography, and he was specifically looking at bondage, and I can't remember what they call it. I don't know why I can't think of the word, but anyway, he was looking into like the bondage and torture side, and she had to sit down with him and say, this is not how a lot of people do this. This is a specific, interest area, but I don't want you to think that this is a typical sexual activity, right? So it wasn't about it being good or bad. It was about me as a parent interacting with you and telling you that's not how I have sex with my husband, right? And that's not how a lot of people do that. So it's important to think practically about safety. So again, we talked about that. How does a person use public transportation without talking to a stranger? Something happens in the community and all that person sees as strangers, who do they ask for help? And then what is a long-term plan for providing persons of trust outside of the family unit? The saddest thing I have to say, and the truest thing that I have to say, is that none of us are immortal. We want to live forever. We want to be the ones to support and love our kids unconditionally for the rest of their life, but we have to build that network. And it's important to build that network full of people that and that are safe, from people that you can trust, right? So that there is someone that your kid can turn to in those times when we're not there, whether that mean because we're not living and not available, or because we're just not physically available. Again, we talk about the boundaries, and there's, again, another example of the circles curriculum. You can see I really like it. I think that's like the 4th slide. And then lastly, the dignity of risk. So this was actually written in 1972. And I'm going to just go over the highlights. So many of our best achievements, and I'm talking about you and me, guys, all of us right here. Many of our best achievements came the hard way. We took risks. We fell flat. We suffered. We picked ourselves up, and we tried again. Sometimes we made it and sometimes we didn't. Even so, we were given the chance to try. And persons with special needs need those chances too. And that is how they're going to learn. As a parent, I know I don't want to see my daughter struggle. I don't want to see her heartbreak. I don't want her to see, her cry. But she's learned so much from the experiences. And she's learned, just like when we're very, very young and we touch that hot iron and we really, that's the only way for us to realize we should not touch that hot iron, right? And unfortunately, a lot of times that's the way with relationships and sexuality as well. And the example that we give in the presentation is and if you could raise your hand, I would ask you to raise your hand, but how many of you are married or in a long-term relationship with your first boyfriend or girlfriend? Not many of us, right? There's some of us, and congratulations if you're one of them. But not many of us have done that. We've been through heartache. We have been through bad relationships. We've had people not treat us nicely. We've had people cheat on us. You know, these are things that we have gone through and we have learned, and that we can't always protect our kids from having those experiences. We can give them the knowledge and we can make them resilient, right? But sometimes going through those issues is what's going to make them resilient. And I can tell you that I've worked with so many kids that have been through a breakup or have been rejected, and getting through that and moving on to the next experience can be very empowering, build a lot of confidence to know that they did it. They did that. Nobody was there trying to block them from the experience, trying to protect them. They lived through it themselves. They learned from it. So it's just something I want you all to consider. And then that's the end. Here are some of the resources, self-advocate resources, the LGBTQ resources, if you're interested in that. There's some people of color resources, and then social media resources as well. And that is the end of the presentation. Thanks for bearing with me as I talk like an auctioneer.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Boy, this is some really great information, and we really, I think it's a topic that a lot of people are. I'm glad to see the people that were here, and hopefully those that weren't able to come, it'll be available for them to watch on if they go through their Google Drive and with it being recorded. But I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so that if anybody wants to ask any questions, they can. So let me go ahead and stop the recording.